Welcome to the Twin Cities Apologetics Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Lynn, and I have a very special guest here, James Warner Wallace.
Good to be here. Good to be here. Yeah. We haven't had a chance to really sit down and talk since we were together at CIA, so this is good.
Yeah, it'd be really nice to have...
just to catch up.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, and have a conversation about something that's very important in this area of apologetics and making a defense for our faith.
Yeah.
And that's the topic of how do we look at evidence as Christians, or maybe even anyone coming into the consideration of Christianity, and is it true, and how can we know that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is not unusual. Everyone kind of comes to this table with some interest in Christianity, either for or against, and they have some skill set they can actually lean in with, right? So I think my contribution is almost always going to be in this narrow area of, well, what qualifies? How do we assess evidence and make a proper inference, right? So we're beyond a reasonable doubt. We're never going to get beyond a possible doubt, but we want to get beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you think about it, that's a skill set that all of us need to have. And when we fill up a jury with just folks out of the community, we ask them to learn the skill set that detectives employed to collect this evidence and evaluate it. And so I think most of us have either watched stuff on TV or have been involved in jury trials as a juror that has taught them something about, well, how do I decide what is true on the basis of evidence, and what would count, what would qualify as evidence? And so that's really, I get asked this question a lot, Jeremy, like, okay, well, so you're looking at the evidence from cosmology, or you're looking at evidence from manuscript evidence from the New Testament. Well, do you have a PhD in cosmology? Well, no, I don't. I'm not an astrophysicist, and I don't have a degree in biblical languages. I mean, my degree is in theological studies, but I don't have an expertise in biblical manuscripts. I can't tell you. But this is true for all jurors too. And what I've noticed working in criminal trials is that we call in PhDs to tell us something about data, and also to give us an expert opinion. But both sides call in PhDs, and they don't agree with each other. And there's just as many PhDs who would say the biblical evidence is sound and we should trust it, that it's reliable, as there are PhDs who say it's not sound and we shouldn't trust it as reliable. So what I've learned is, when working with juries, is we trust the PhDs to give us the data. But I reserve the opinion. That's what we ask the jurors to do, is they give us. Now, we will ask for an expert opinion, but we don't put experts on juries. We just put regular citizens on juries. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, I don't have that expertise, well, neither do I. What we do is we learn how evidence works. We learn how to make proper inferences, and then we can enter any discipline without a PhD and actually learn something and make a decision.
Right, that's a good point. And I think some people, maybe who don't take a Christian view, often kind of point to those PhDs, point to the experts and say, hey, we need to almost fully rely on them not only for the data, but for our view, what our view should be,
your inference
what our opinion should be.
Yeah. And so I think what the risk is that if that's the case, all I can do is tell you, well, I've got a PhD who disagrees with you. Not my PhD, but I know somebody who's got a PhD, or there's some experts I can point to. Well, everyone can do that. In the end, we have to be able to say, okay, well, what's the data? So for example, I typically will look at the exact same biological, the exact same physical data that my atheist friends who are interested in physics, they're using the same data points that I'm using. Well, what do we infer from information in DNA? What do we infer from the appearance of fine-tuning in the universe? That's the real question. And the experts can agree on what the data says about the fine-tuning, but we might disagree on what the proper inference from the data is. And so, but at the same time, I want to hear what everyone says, what all the different sides say. But in the end, I reserve the right, like our jurors do, to make a decision based not on necessarily the expert opinion. Because what happens is you present your expert, right? And he says, I found these two pieces of fabric at the crime scene, and it's got this serological evidence on it. And in my opinion, this would mean that your defendant is involved in this case because he deposited those. And then the other expert from the other side will get up and say, well, I get it. I agree. There's some two pieces of fabric there, and they have some serological evidence, but this could have been deposited there some other way. And they'll try to argue for a different inference. Now, both opinions are offered to the jury, and the jury gets to decide which of these two opinions seems most supported supported by the evidence.
Right.
And they can actually decide, okay, and every case does this, you're deciding with some PhDs and against others when you render your verdict. And I think this is true for us as observers who don't possess a PhD, is that we get to listen to both sides, and then it's okay for you to say, well, yeah, but that it's reasonable. And a lot of what we try to do in our work is to say, well, look, this is how evidence is used, and everything counts as evidence. People ask me all the time, what kinds of things count as evidence? Everything. Everything has the potential. But there are broad categories. There's direct evidence, which is eyewitness testimony. So if you've got somebody who saw the event, now obviously we're not going to be able to use direct evidence to make inferences about the beginning of the universe or even about ancient events, because we don't have access to eyewitnesses. Now, there may be a written eyewitness account. That's a different thing. But we can't cross-examine that witness, right?
Right.
So a lot of times what we're doing is we're making inferences based on indirect evidence, the other form. And that is everything else. DNA is indirect evidence. Fingerprints, indirect evidence. In our study, archaeology would be indirect evidence. There's indirect evidence of the accounts themselves, how we examine the texts themselves. So I think but everything counts. And everything is usable. So that's one of the things I try to help people with is that, don't think that the only way to prove this would be if you had a living, because if that was the case, if I needed a living eyewitness to determine something was true, especially about a historical event, I could have no confidence beyond my own. You want to know your parents, but do you know your great-grandparents? Is anybody still alive who knew your great-grandparents? But you think you know something about your great-grandparents, but you really can't if you're going to limit yourself to certain forms of evidence.
Right.
And you have to kind of toss away all of history. I don't think we're willing to do that.
Yeah. And I'm curious, you're talking about expert witnesses before.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who kind of refers to consensus, saying, like, let's take the area of cosmology.
Right.
Someone says 80% of cosmologists think this thing about the universe.
Yes.
So therefore we should believe them because they're experts, and most of the people in that field believe this thing.
Well, so if I told you I had a view that was being supportive of the defendant, that's offered by 80% of the people the jury has heard, but if you knew that the 80% the jury had heard were all family members of the defendant, you would say, well, I don't care if they're 80% of the people we heard in this trial support the defendant. They all happen to be in other words, they might possess some bias that would drive them to say something. They might even infer this is true for themselves. They would say, because they know this guy, and there's no way he could have done this. But you might say, well, yeah, but if the entire group possesses a similar bias, then maybe the entire group is wrong. So I think what we're looking at is we're saying, okay, especially if we are moving away from a view that admits anything immaterial, anything non-physical, anything that is supernatural, if those things are now out of bounds to our thinking, because we are post-enlightenment, believers or post-enlightenment investigators, well, then there may be that why we agree on some of these issues is driven more by our common presuppositions than it is by the quality of the evidence. So I'm always trying to ask, well, okay, that's fine. If I've got like 8 witnesses who came in and testified to this, I just want to make sure they're not driven by the same presupposition. Because if they are, then all of them as a group have to be kind of considered in a different category. Yeah. And I think what's happening in the sciences, in the natural sciences, is that we have a presuppositional bias against anything immaterial, anything non-physical, anything supernatural. So I think there are some things that even as an atheist, I would have said I believe to be immaterial realities that were probably beyond my materialistic explanation, my experience of consciousness and free agency, my experience of there are some things I cannot experience through a purely physical construct, right? So I have to, at least I think also the origin of the universe calls for something that is non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material, that is the first cause of everything that is spatial, temporal, and material. So I think I was already stuck with some acceptance of a non-physical reality, and at least I would have said it was extra-natural.
Yeah.
If not supernatural.
Yeah. So basically, what I'm hearing is we can't just look at percentages, saying 80%, 90%. Right. We have to look at other factors, such as a bias amongst a certain group of people.
Because if that was true, we could have historically gone back to a point in the not too distant past when the majority of scientists would have argued for just the opposite. Now we can argue, well, no, we've learned more But we could also argue, no, we've slipped into a presupposition more than we ever did before. So I'm just not sure which of those two it is, right? So if we're going to say consensus, we should always agree with consensus. Well, I don't think scientists would ever say that, because all scientific discoveries are usually against the consensus held at the time. So we should at least be open to the idea that if something pops up that ruins the consensus theory, that we're open to it. Science has historically been open to those kinds of things. So I think I still hold that position that, I understand that there are going to be consensus thoughts on certain issues, but I also am open to the idea that someone's going to come along and destroy all that with a new theory. But here I'm just saying, what if the theory points to mine? What if the theory, and we said this in this conference, this idea that we're only allowed in science to ask like 5 of the 6 classic questions. We can ask what, where, when, why, and how. So we can ask those questions, but we're not allowed to ask the 6th question, which is the who question. So you're only allowed to ask 5 in the natural sciences. When in any investigation, why just allow me to ask the 6th? Why, if all the evidence points to a who, am I allowed to entertain a who? And if I'm not allowed to entertain a who, why am I not allowed to do that?
Right.
Like, so what is it? I mean, can you imagine if I said, I'm going to work your case, but it's a mystery. This person vanished. And I have no idea if it was somebody caused that person to vanish or what. This person's just missing. Am I allowed to ask every kind of question to solve this mystery? I think most people would say yes, but in the sciences, we're only allowed to ask 5/6 of the available questions. And that seems to me to be the presuppositional bias we need to work against. I'm not going to jump to a who. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to say, oh, God did it every time I can't answer it. But at least if I've got good evidence that points to I think information, for example, in the DNA points to intelligence. I don't know how you can get around asking a who question there. But I'm not going to jump to that right away. I get it. A lot of things can be answered with the other 5 questions, but there are some things you cannot answer without the who question. Let me ask it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I would say certain questions are downplayed within certain people who focus on science, such as I believe Richard Dawkins in one of his debates said at one point, the why questions are just silly questions. The science is focused on the what, explaining what is out there in nature. To me, though, the why questions are some of the most important questions, along with the who questions that we can ask in our lives.
So we can ask why questions only to a certain degree in science, as it seems. We can ask, well, why does this domino fall a certain way? What's striking it that would cause it? We can ask that kind of why. But like, we can ask, well, what causes your body temperature to remain at the level it remains? We can get lots of processes that can explain this. But in the end, why is it this way? That's a question that is a metaphysical question that transcends science, it seems to me. We're eventually going to find processes in your biochemistry that'll explain your body temperature. But when you ask, why does this happen this way? That's why I think Dawkins would say it's a silly question. But all of metaphysics, all this idea about the big grand questions, the overarching questions that explain our existence, I think are questions that probably are the most important, the most interesting questions to us as humans. Is purpose questions. Why am I here? That's a question science can't answer for you.
Right.
So it seems like a bunch of the questions that we think are the most powerful and give meaning to life are questions that aren't even asked by the scientific endeavor.
So that kind of points us to the idea, let's start looking at other areas. Yes, keep science there, don't avoid it.
Well, yeah,
it's very important.
I'm somebody in cases who's always going to refer to scientific. I'm going to collect data. So the facts and the evidences that I offer in front of a jury are always going to be using some form of scientific collection or investigation or processing or testing. But in the end, how we infer from those data is entirely different. I don't want people to have a preconceived notion. Just be open. And we always ask that question of jury selection, right? The question is not, well, do you hold a bias? We know everyone's got opinions, and can you suspend your bias long enough to look at this case? Because otherwise, you're never going to impanel a jury.
Right.
So I think we have to kind of move beyond. But again, you can see how the presupposition, in the end, can ruin everything. I wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. The very first chapter, what are the key investigative tools, is the simplest tool of all, and that is simply don't be a know-it-all. Don't think you know who did this crime before you even start investigating it. Don't think you know that the answer can only be in certain categories. There cannot be a who in science. That is suggesting that the nature of the universe in a way that we really don't know with certainty. At least be open. And I think you can still do good science, because in that case, if there is a who, the entire project is about figuring out how that who operates in the universe. How that who, you're learning something about the nature of the who every time you answer a what or a why or a how. And I think that for a lot of people drove them to want to do science in times past, just to want to know more about the who.
Right.
But now we are, I think if you think about it, as we shift toward autonomy, the only who's we seem to be interested in are us, right? And I don't really want there to be a who out there that I might have to bend my knee to. And I think that's a lot of what drives crimes, and it's also a lot of what drives our investigation of our environment.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we're going to take a quick break right now, and then once we come back, we'll talk about basically how do we interpret evidence as Christians, looking at the case for Christianity. So thanks for the conversation so far, and we'll continue. Did you know 75% of young people leave the church upon entering college? How can we keep our young people engaged with the church and with the Christian worldview? This is where Rethink 2019 comes in, an exciting student apologetics conference coming to Minneapolis this November. There, top apologetics speakers will train young people to address the challenges to faith they will face as they move into college and beyond. For more information about this conference put on by Stand to Reason, check out the events section of our website, TwinCitiesApologetics.com. That's TwinCitiesApologetics.com. Welcome back to the Twin Cities Apologetics Podcast. I'm here with J. Warner Wallace once again, and we missed a little bit of introduction at the beginning. So if you don't know, Twin Cities Apologetics is a ministry based in Minnesota that equips Christians with resources to help them strengthen and defend their faith. So Jay, I wanted to talk a little bit about how do we take evidence and interpret it and use it to come to a conclusion as Christians looking at the case for Christianity. But first, I want to talk about your experience as a cold case detective, because you looked at a lot of pieces of evidence, whether it was live on the scene or maybe evidence that came from the past that you looked at later on. So I was wondering, can you take us through an example of taking a piece of evidence and examining it and coming to a conclusion? Well,
let me just say this. I have reasonable expectations when I work a cold case that the technology in 1980 created an environment where I'm only going to expect certain things. So for example, I'm probably not going to have as many photographs as I would like to have in a present case, because now we have digital cameras. They've got cards that can hold thousands of photos, and they're going to change the lighting. I mean, you'll have the same image shot thousands of different ways. It doesn't take much space, and I can put that stuff on a drive, and so I've got tons of photos. Back in those days, you had rolls of 24 or 12 pictures on each roll, 35 millimeter film. A guy would do like 6 rolls and feel like he was done. I got enough already. He's only got 60 photos. So I've got a major homicide with 60 photos, and they're not even great quality because they're from back in 1980 with 35 millimeter film. Also, back in those days, guys did not type. We used to take typing lessons or typing school. A guy who comes out of college today and becomes a police officer or detective is so facile with keyboards that those guys would do a supplemental report. You'd be lucky if it was 1,000 words. It'd be like outrageously lucky. Now guys are banging out 5,000 words before they even get started because it's so easy to do it, right? And they're doing it themselves. Back in those days, sometimes these detectives would come back to the station and they would have a steno or somebody who was hired to listen to what they were saying, and they make a mistake. Just add this. Rather than like now we're just going to backspace, keep on typing. So the quality of the written reports and the photographs from a case in 1980, I expect it to be less than, the same thing is true for me with biblical documents, for example, right? It's driven by technology. So how do people write? How did people write these on manuscripts? Do they dictate them to some scribe that doesn't allow you to back up and make a change? That doesn't allow you to, that should be over here. You might try to do something like that, but the technology is going to limit your ability. You can't just cut and paste. I see this in my ancient criminal reports. I say ancient, 30 years ago. Because what I'll see is that a guy will come in, for example, and he would work a case over 3 weeks. And he would have a piece of paper and a typewriter, and he would put the typewriter, a piece of paper on the typewriter, and he would add to his report. And then 2 days later, he'd interview somebody else, and he'd put it back in the typewriter, and he would just add, ding, 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 ding to his report. And sometimes if you read those reports, if it took 3 weeks to write it, you think to yourself, it's got like 6 different authors. Because you can't even tell that the person who wrote this paragraph is the same person who wrote this paragraph, because this day he was just getting back and he used a steno who happened to be, a secretary happened to be there, and he said, hey, can you, real quick, I'll give it to you. And he communicates it to her, and she would clean it up as she was typing it, make it sound better. And the next day he didn't have time for that, so he just put it in the typewriter and banged it out himself. So technology impacts the way we assess those reports. And I have to be careful I understand the environment in which those reports were written, or I can make all kinds of assumptions. I think something similar happens in the manuscript evidence we have for the scripture, right? You have something that is written. We got to ask ourselves, well, is this written in one setting? Is this written with a scribe, with a pair of scribes, with 3 scribes? Is it written by the person's own hand? I mean, you see this in Paul's letters, for example, where he uses scribes and will then stop and say, this is in my own hand. Well, that means you're going to have you might even think that there's no way this guy could have written this letter and this letter, but what you really have are 2 different scribes involved. So you just don't know. So you have to assess all of these things, right? It's the nature of the evidence to draw a conclusion.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it sounds like, let's say there's an examiner today, goes to a crime scene, there's different pieces of evidence there, maybe someone's cell phone, something like that. He can use the current, say, cultural climate or situation to assess that evidence.
Yes.
But if you're looking at evidence from 30 years ago with, like you said, some of that technology, then you need to take into consideration that technology, the cultural atmosphere at the time.
Right, how is it collected?
Yeah.
So for example, we see differences in the gospel accounts, right? Well, if one detective is interviewing all 4 sources, he will see these differences in real time. And he'll ask follow-up questions, because in his own mind he's going, well, yeah, but you only mentioned 1 angel, and this guy mentions 2. So you might say, well, how many angels were there? Oh, there were 2. Oh, but you're only talking, but why, a minute ago you only said 1. Well, that was the one who was talking to us. Okay, now I've got it clarified, because the detective who is doing all of the sources knows the differences in advance, and as he experiences them in real time, he can ask clarifying questions, right? Well, we don't have that with the Gospels, so I would, if you don't have that, if I send a team out to canvass the neighborhood and talk to all the possible witnesses, I'm going to get a set of reports back with 4 or 5 different authors talking to 4 or 5 different witnesses. I guarantee you I'm going to see far more variation in the accounts than I even do in the Gospels. The only way to get rid of that is to go revisit all of those witnesses with all the differences in your head and say, let me ask you a question. So how many angels were there? A follow-up question. Not going to give him the answer. You're just going to ask another follow-up question. But this isn't happening in the Gospels. So there are things that when I first read through the Gospels, I said, wow, I can tell that there's not a secondary set of clarifying questions that's been asked by an investigator here. And this is kind of like when you canvass a neighborhood and you get all these reports back, you're going to go, wow, this is a mess.
Yeah.
Right? I got to figure this out now.
Yeah.
And when in a cold case, those people are no longer available to you.
Yeah.
A lot of those people have died, or they've moved out of state, or whatever the case may be. You're kind of doing the same thing in cold cases that you are when you're evaluating those 4 accounts in the New Testament.
Yeah.
There are some principles that apply both ways, right? I have to at least be sensitive to that. So for me, I just started off looking at the Gospels and trying to determine, number one, do I really think that they contain anything that could be considered an eyewitness account? 2 of them may, right? I think they do. Matthew and John. But what's interesting about Luke and Mark is we have good reason to believe that they're talking to eyewitnesses to write their accounts as well.
Yeah.
Well, that puts me in a different category. So now I'm actually assessing, and there's a template for this. Were they written early enough to actually have been written by eyewitnesses? Do they have any kind of corroborative evidence? And when I say corroborative evidence, what I mean is touch point corroboration. It would be great if I had a video for every crime I ever investigated, but I don't. So if you say, hey, yeah, he reached up and he jumped on the table, well, I should be able to go back and find palm prints where you said and if I find those palm prints, I've now corroborated his statement, your statement to me about him. But this won't tell me anything about what he wore. And it won't tell me anything about what he said when he did it. All this is telling me is I have to infer from touch point corroboration that your statement is reliable. Same thing happens in the New Testament, right? There's going to be touch point evidence. If you think you can check a box for every little data point in the Gospels, you're crazy. You're not going to be able to do that. And you wouldn't be able to do it in a cold case either. You're just going to have enough corroborative evidence that your jury says, yeah, I've got no reason to distrust it. So what I've noticed is that people who distrust the account are not relying as much on the nature of evaluating accounts as they are on the pure fact that they include some supernatural elements. And those in a naturalistic environment where we're already kind of post-enlightenment, it's like, wow, those can't be true.
Right. Yeah.
And even if you assessed them under eyewitness structure, you said, okay, there's a template for eyewitness reliability, and they passed the test, people would still say, no, it can't be true, though, because they include miracles.
Right.
So that's not, though, about whether they pass a test, evidentially. That's about whether you hold a bias against the supernatural.
Sure. Yeah, and I think a lot of this stuff that you're talking about of being a detective and looking at past evidence and how we go about that is very valuable, because I think people looking at the Gospels today, they can have this, a 21st century American type of view on it, saying like, right. Oh, these need to be basically identical or very close to, and otherwise I'm not going to trust it. Never the case.
And in guys who work this for a living, they always, in my audiences, there's always investigators, detectives from some agencies, and they right away get that.
Right.
That we just never get a case that's that clean. And this is why defense attorneys make inroads with juries, because they're going to attack the subtle differences and try to argue that they can't be trusted because there are differences in the accounts. Yet, even though that happens, we've got aggressive, really well-served, I've worked with some defensive teams that have done a great job for their client. I think most of us are able to get past that when they realize that, there are many things that cause us to see things slightly differently.
Yeah.
And it's that richness that we're looking for. The only thing I ever ask when I get called out to a homicide scene is I ask the dispatcher to have the officers on the scene separate the eyewitnesses. That's the only thing I ask. I'm not going to say get CSI out there. No, just separate the eyewitnesses. I'll be there in half an hour. Because when I get there, I don't want them to have talking to each other. I don't want them to align their stories. I want their stories to remain different, because it's those differences that are full of clues that'll help me solve the case. And if they just align their stories, so the first thing I ask is separate the eyewitnesses. That's really the only directive I have.
Yeah. So there's one more question I want to ask, kind of more on the practical side.
Yes.
We did talk through some things that are definitely practical of how do we look at the Gospels and view them in light of being in our cultural context, and that we need to consider the cultural context of that time and how those accounts were put together. But for practical sake, along with that, for Christians looking at maybe an argument for God's existence that they hear, that they haven't heard before, or looking at a historical piece of evidence, say regarding the Gospels or regarding Jesus, what would you say is the main principle that Christians should take regarding looking at that evidence? Like, what is kind of a first step they should do in that process?
If it's eyewitness stuff we're doing, and you just know the template, just know what qualifies something as reliable from an eyewitness perspective. It's all about, were they really there to see what they said they saw? Can it be corroborated in some way? Doesn't it be completely corroborated? But is there any, for example, if you're looking at the Book of Mormon, you won't find any level of corroboration for the Book of Mormon. No archaeological corroboration, no textual corroboration. You have nothing to track. So I don't expect you to have every detail corroborated, but I do expect you to have some percentage corroborated. Right? This is true in every criminal trial. Third thing is, have they changed their story over time? So I'm looking for transmission of the documents, right? I'm also looking for transmission of the eyewitness account. Hey, you said this in 1980, but now you're not saying that anymore. Or you said this just 5 years ago when somebody interviewed you for the news. And now you're not saying that anymore. Well, I'm not going to be able to use you in a trial, because that issue of your changing story is going to be it's going to kill your testimony. And the last thing is, do you possess a bias? And there's only 3 biases. That's the pursuit of money, sexual lust, and the pursuit of power. Those 3 things cause people to lie. So once I've eliminated those 4 issues and settled those 4 issues on a witness, I feel comfortable using that witness in trial. And that's what we're trying to do with the Gospels. Can they pass the test in those 4 areas?
Right.
And so that's why I would say, if you're looking at the manuscript evidence related to eyewitnesses, is just know the template. That's helpful, because it'll allow you, those 4 things are what determines something is reliable.
Yeah, and to get a really good grasp on that template, I definitely recommend your work, Cold Case Christianity, where you go through a lot of those principles and what people can use to look at the Gospels and see, is this a reliable source?
Yeah, and it was not something that I created for that book. It's just, this is the process that I used in order to determine, do I want to be part of this? Do I think this is worth paying attention to? In the end, what we want to be able to make the case for is that the Bible is reliable and you ought to take it seriously. And sometimes we get caught up on all the political stuff and all the stuff that's downstream culturally. I get that. Those are important issues. But the real issue starts at a foundation. Is the Bible reliable, and should we take it seriously? So I just try to stay in the little lane there of trying to help people with that one question. Because if we agreed that the Bible was reliable, and we ought not just take a verse out of context, we ought to take it seriously and build our case on the basis of what the totality of Scripture teaches, I think we'd be in the same place on almost every other issue that matters. Right. And so that's why I think it's important for us to make the case for those other two things before we make the case for anything else.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's our time here for this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this important topic, as all of these topics are really about interpreting evidence for the case for Christianity.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we'll see you next time on the Twin Cities Apologetics Podcast.